The sun was just beginning to set as 5 friends, Jake, Sarah, Emily, Mike, and Lisa, arrived at the edge of the dense, sprawling forest known as the Forest of Shadows. The forest had a notorious reputation among locals for being haunted by shadowy creatures, but the group, eager for adventure and dismissive of local legends, decided it was the perfect spot for a weekend camping trip. "We'll set up camp here," Jake said, pointing to a small clearing just inside the tree line. He was the unofficial leader of the group, always the one to suggest their latest thrill-seeking adventure. Sarah, Jake's girlfriend, looked around nervously. "Are you sure about this, Jake? I've heard some pretty creepy stories about this place." Mike, ever the skeptic, laughed. "Come on, Sarah, those are just stories. We're going to have an awesome time." They unpacked their gear and pitched their tents as the last light of day faded away, casting long shadows among the trees. The forest was eerily quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves and distant animal calls. Once the campfire was lit, the group settled in for an evening of laughter, stories, and marshmallow roasting. As the night grew darker, a sense of unease settled over the camp. The fire flickered, casting strange, dancing shadows on the surrounding trees. Lisa, always the most superstitious of the group, shivered and moved closer to the fire. "Did you guys hear that?" she whispered. Emily rolled her eyes. "Lisa, it's just the wind. Relax." But then they all heard it, a low, almost inaudible whispering, coming from the depths of the forest. It was as if the trees themselves were speaking. The sound sent chills down their spines. "Maybe we should turn in for the night," Jake suggested, trying to keep the tremor out of his voice. "We have a big day of hiking tomorrow." Reluctantly, they agreed. They doused the fire and retreated to their tents, the whispering still faintly echoing in their ears. As they drifted off to sleep, none of them noticed the shadowy figures lurking just beyond the firelight. The next morning, the group awoke to find Mike's tent empty. At first, they assumed he had gone for an early morning hike, but as the hours passed and he didn't return, their concern grew. "Maybe he got lost," Emily suggested, though she didn't sound convinced. Jake shook his head. "Mike knows how to handle himself in the woods. We should split up and look for him." They divided into pairs, Jake with Sarah and Emily with Lisa, agreeing to search for an hour and then meet back at the campsite. As they ventured deeper into the forest, the trees seemed to close in around them, their branches intertwining like skeletal fingers. Jake and Sarah called out for Mike, their voices swallowed by the dense foliage. Suddenly, Sarah stopped, pointing to the ground. "Jake, look at this." In the dirt were large, claw-like footprints, unlike anything they had ever seen. They seemed to lead deeper into the forest, towards an area shrouded in even thicker shadows. "We should go back and tell the others," Sarah urged, her voice trembling. Jake nodded, and they hurried back to the campsite, only to find it empty. Emily and Lisa were nowhere to be seen. Panic set in as Jake and Sarah realized their friends were missing. They searched the campsite for any clues, but found nothing except the eerie silence of the forest. "We need to stay together," Jake said, his voice firm despite the fear gnawing at him. "Let's follow those footprints and see where they lead." As they ventured further into the forest, the trees grew taller and the shadows deeper. The whispering returned, louder this time, as if urging them to turn back. But they pressed on, driven by a desperate need to find their friends. Hours passed, and the forest seemed to twist and change around them, disorienting their sense of direction. Just when they were about to give up hope, they stumbled upon an old, abandoned cabin hidden among the trees. "Maybe Mike and the others are in there," Sarah said, though she didn't sound hopeful. They approached the cabin cautiously, the wooden door creaking as they pushed it open. Inside, the air was cold and damp, filled with the scent of decay. The floor was littered with old, rotting furniture and strange symbols carved into the walls. "Jake, look at this," Sarah whispered, pointing to a corner of the room. Huddled in the corner, looking pale and terrified, was Mike. He was shivering uncontrollably, his eyes wide with fear. "Mike, what happened?" Jake asked, rushing to his friend's side. Mike's voice was barely a whisper. "The shadows, they took Emily and Lisa. We have to get out of here." As Jake and Sarah helped Mike to his feet, the whispering grew louder, almost deafening. The shadows in the room seemed to come alive, stretching and twisting into monstrous shapes. They knew they had to leave, and fast. They burst out of the cabin and ran through the forest, the shadows chasing after them. Every step felt like a struggle, as if the forest itself was trying to hold them back. Finally, they stumbled upon a clearing bathed in moonlight, and for a moment, the shadows retreated. Catching their breath, they looked around and saw an ancient stone altar at the center of the clearing. Strange symbols, similar to those in the cabin, were etched into its surface. "This must be the source," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "The forest's dark secret." As they examined the altar, they noticed a small, weathered book lying nearby. Jake picked it up and began to read aloud, the words written in an archaic language. "The shadows are bound to this place, cursed to guard the forest for eternity," he translated. "Only a sacrifice of light can break the curse." Mike, regaining some of his strength, looked at the altar and then at his friends. "We have to destroy it. It's the only way to save Emily and Lisa." Determined to end the nightmare, they gathered all the flashlights and lanterns they had, placing them around the altar. As they turned on the lights, the shadows screamed in agony, writhing and twisting in the moonlight. The ground trembled as the ancient curse fought to maintain its hold. Jake continued to read from the book, chanting the incantation that would break the curse. The light from the lanterns grew brighter, piercing through the darkness. With one final burst of energy, the altar cracked and shattered, releasing a blinding flash of light. The shadows let out a final, agonized wail before dissipating into the night. When the light faded, the forest was silent. The oppressive darkness that had suffocated the forest was gone, replaced by a tranquil, moonlit night. In the clearing, Emily and Lisa lay unconscious but unharmed. Jake, Sarah, and Mike rushed to their friends, tears of relief streaming down their faces. They had survived the forest of shadows and uncovered its dark secret. The group made their way back to the campsite, exhausted but victorious. They packed up their gear and left the forest as quickly as they could, not looking back. As they drove away, the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon. The forest of shadows was behind them, but its memory would haunt them forever. "Do you think anyone will believe us?" Emily asked, her voice still shaky. Jake shook his head. "Probably not, but we know the truth, and we made it out together." They returned to their lives, forever changed by their ordeal. The forest's dark secret was laid to rest, and the shadowy creatures were no more. But the legend of the Forest of Shadows lived on, a cautionary tale for those who dared to venture into the unknown. And as the forest slowly reclaimed the ancient altar, the whispering began to fade, leaving behind only the echoes of a forgotten curse. Years later, a new group of thrill-seekers arrived at the edge of the Forest of Shadows, unaware of the horrors that lay within. As they set up camp and the sun began to set, the whispering returned, faint but unmistakable. The forest had a way of holding onto its secrets, and the shadows were always waiting.